Well, so the lack of self-generated ideology in Africa is hurting its growth and exposing it to vultures. There lies an art in simplicity and calling things what they are without being perceived as lacking depth or deviating from the established norms. When it comes to a field such as economics, we all agree that being able to measure progress is pretty much a big deal and would most likely be easier if one knew what to measure or quantify without any ambiguity. However, it is unfortunate that when dabbling with sensational policies which you didn't develop yourself, the measuring becomes a bit of a problem. And so one thing that African economies have been great at, it's functioning well for the external parties through the aid of this sensationalized external economic policies. That is, it works more for external parties than it does for people who live within it, within the respective countries of Africa. Now, this is because it is easier to rush to proposing and poorly implementing populistic policies used in developed countries. Even worse, policies not necessarily used by the developed countries, but rather overly recommended for the developing countries by the developed countries, who themselves have no empirical first-hand experience of the complex dynamics that exist in regions such as Africa. Often these are policies developed with nefarious self-interest elements woven into them, or simply developed on a desk in some high-end research consultancy firm somewhere in London or Manhattan. These research consultancy firms have a bias of not having to endure the consequences of their selfish recommendations. For example, high unemployment or low, if non-existent disaster management budgets due to tax evading foreign multinationals allowed lax operating environments with low scrutiny as a result of misinformed selfish recommendations. What adds salt to the wound is that most of such tax evasions are often facilitated by the very same consultancy firms that recommend these policies to these countries. So ideally, it would be acceptable if one country's financial policies could exclusively remain theirs, to isolate any wrong decisions made by them, by not having a domino effect of one bad decision cascading into countries within the same region. However, it is unfortunate that most African countries cut and paste critical fiscal policies. Ultimately, they end up replicating vague economic policies riddled with flaws and illogical fallacies, along with the problems they bring with them, such as unemployment, inequality, and appalling tax evasion. In essence, African countries are obsessively replicating vague economic policies that were developed externally and by default have an external focus. These have serious problems with critical social implications. Most African countries are championing policies which work against their own growth and, most importantly, their social stability. After all, what good use are policies that create a strong, quote-unquote, strong, externally focused economy with little to no direct benefit for its own people? Such are the consequences of lacking critical self-generated ideology, which in turn shapes self-generated economic policies, along with their culture to sustain and refine them through time. Now, the upside of having such, because perhaps this is important, that the upside of having such self-generated ideology can be observed in other countries that understand clearly what economic theory they are operating on, even though that might not be communicated openly, as it might be labeled as suspicious or otherwise. For them, or otherwise for them. So, for example, in the United States, Wall Street understands clearly what economic theory is at play. And the mantra has never changed for pretty much 100 years or almost 100 years down the line. When we move far east, in China or Japan, the same principle applies, that is, besides what is communicated to the outside world internally, there exists a clear understanding and practical application of the Chinese or Japanese economic theory, respectively, without any vagueness or guilt of being perceived as lacking in some moral principle or whatsoever. So they are consistent with their own self-generated economic policies. And of course, the results speak for themselves on how their economies, they've managed to make their own economies work for them internally. If African countries continue in this route of externalizing critical ideology and policies, we will witness a phenomenon where African economies grow without having any significant social change due to the socio-economic decoupling which emerges as a result of externalized economic policies. This will be further exacerbated by the shift towards digitalization and automation. This will leave Africa with growing numbers of inequality, worsening unemployment and unemployability due to lack of skills and critical infrastructure. Even with the growing Sino-Africa relations, because Africa lacks a unified economic front, leveraging the relation will prove to be difficult, thus allowing China the upper hand in a divided Africa. Furthermore, the introduction of the Africa Free Trade Agreement will not remedy this, as itself is more of a pan-African gesture, because Africa will need the bare minimum infrastructure critical to such trade or such a trade zone. Not to mention the fundamental fact that for intertrade to work on a mass scale in the continent, most African countries will need to have critical industrial facilities such as refineries to process the mostly raw goods to be traded amongst these countries, to produce end products ready to be exported or consumed internally to stimulate real internally focused socio-economic benefits. This is because mostly in Africa, what's exported and it's mostly raw material, and that raw material could benefit the African region more if it was refined into an end product locally. However, for this to happen, it will need a strong shift in ideology and self-generated economic policies that will emphasize building internal capacity for the African countries. What we are more likely to witness is a deepening duality in the Saharan and sub-Saharan Africa divide. This might be a good thing, as it will allow a contrast in these two Africas, so much so that it forces countries in the sub-Saharan Africa to get their act together as far as self-generated ideologies and economic policies go. This will also be an advantage for these countries to redefine what democracy is for them as it begins to grow in strength in the sub-Saharan African countries. The ability to reimagine African countries with their own form of democratic ideology that embraces what works more than what looks good on paper or in the international stage. So in conclusion, to clarify, ideology does not dismiss the consideration of empirical evidence. The emphasis here is that of the overall objectives of most Africa's economies. The core question we pose here is that who is the economy in Africa working for? The structural problems are are obvious to anyone, let alone the shaky strength of many of Africa's constitutional institutions, more especially those directly linked with deciding on critical economic activities. And this we cast into the spotlight, so that critical questions can be asked. And if Africa is to pivot, it should pivot now, while there is still time.